So I'm just going to start by, pressing out and creating this sort of a shape. I'm just going to give it this random color, and I'm going to create some sort of an animation that is going to help us in different sort of places. I'm just going to come to the position and just maybe press a keyframe. I'm just going to have it to start from there, jump to something like 20 frames and put it this side, and then come to 40 frames, 40, and just copy and paste the keyframe. I can add some easings, but I won't talk about them apparently now. So when I can press N to actually make sure that this is literally the place where the sort of a thing is ending, and I'm just going to play it back. As you can see, it's actually looping and playing back and forth. This is going to be very important. So firstly, I'm going to start with the zoom sort of a thing here. It works like it works in After Effects. You can zoom it to 50% to 10%, or zoom to fit, which I kind of recommend. But depending on how you want to be zoomed in, just be maybe pressing this button, or you can actually just enter in a figure that I want it to be zoomed in 60%, and it will zoom in to 60%. So I'm going to set it back to zoom to fit. Here you can actually play it's actually playback button, which shortcut is actually space. Once I click on it, it plays back. Same thing when I press space. It's the same sort of a thing as a playback. Here it jumps actually to the next frame, right? So once you click onto it, it goes to the next frame, which is actually very nice. It jumps one frame, and then here it jumps basically 5. It goes back. I mean, here it actually goes back to the start, right, and end of the sort of composition, right? Not necessarily composition where you sort of the composition sort of playback thingy, it basically ends, and then the start, which is actually very, very nice. And then we have this sort of a button. Once by default is actually at loop, right? Once you disable it, it plays the animation once. Once you enable it, it actually loops it, which is actually very, very nice for you to note, right? Then we have tags. Now tags are really, really very detailed. I don't want to go into them because it's more or less like a filtering system, right? Apparently here there's you can actually enable a tag, and then you can create connections. For example, let me add I'm not going to talk about them because they are really, really very detailed, but when I add different sort of shapes and elements in here, right, let me just add as many as I can. All right, those are enough. Each element has its own, it has this sort of a thingy which symbolizes a tag. Now tags are very, very detailed. For example, once I click on I don't need actually to click anywhere. Once I click on this sort of a thingy, it shows or opens what we call a tag drawer, right? Apparently each element is actually tagged differently. For example, you can tag or filter them by colors. If I change the colors in here to lavender, it's going to create another sort of color in here, and then another color, right? Think of tags as literally filtering sort of systems, right? Apparently I can click on any sort of tag in here. Once I click on it, I can, it can ask me to assign a tag, right? Let me say I've assigned this something like a head. Think of it as a filtering system. It's going to assign it. Now I don't want to go into the details of what tags are or something like that. I can also create a new tag by just maybe I can call this edge, and then I can click on it, and then it goes in there. So I can just create a new tag, and then you can assign a tag to a selection, and then it will go in there whenever I click on edge or something like that. So these are really, really very detailed, and let me just maybe have them uncleared. So you can have actually the selection in here to either filter the scene window or filter the viewport or filter both, right? Which is actually very nice. Here when I click on, let me say I'm filtering both, right? Once I click onto this, when the search for head, any sort of the thingy that's, into the sort of this sort of tag, it will actually come in there, which can be actually very nice, right? For now, let me just maybe remove them or disable them or something like that. So that's basically the tag drawer. It basically filters. Let me just actually disable this, right? Let me go back to the select thingy. So it basically does more filtering of these layers depending on where you've assigned a tag, right? I can come here, once I type head, I can basically assign that layer to head or something like that. So yeah, that's basically it. I will talk about tags in a detailed sort of video. Okay, that's basically it to do with the tags. Here you can actually drag them in here, or you can actually assign connections once you click in there. So I'm just going to click here and basically disable that. The next one is to do with color management, right? Once you click onto it, it changes the color from sRGB. Actually, I can just click here. It changes the color from sRGB to any of these. You can actually change the color to rec or 7 display or something like that. So by default, it's in sRGB. You can actually also change the composition bitrate. Apparently, it enables 16 and 8 sort of bitrates. Sometimes you may want it to actually be into 16 to actually make sure that you don't have some bandwidth, you know, bandwidth. Banding. It's actually called banding. Yeah, when you're using more of gradients and stuff. So sometimes you're going to keep it at 8 bits or something like that. Yeah, that's it to do with the color management. So I'll leave it turned off for now. Then we have snapping. You can actually enable layers to snap. For example, when I click V, go to selection tool, I can, for example, right now, if it's not enabled, layers do not snap anywhere, right? I can't really snap any layer to anything. Let me just maybe have any of these layers selected. If I move them around, they don't snap to anything, right? But if I enable the snapping and I move the layers around, right, I can actually have them snap to another layer, which is actually very, very nice. And there are lots of snapping sort of settings that we should talk about. Once I enable this sort of grids, as you can see, it can also snap to the grids, right? Let me just maybe enable some of those. So it can be like snap to the composition, snap to the point, snap to the ruler, snap to the grid. So it can also snap to the grids. Once you move it around, it will be snapping to the grids and snapping to the composition, which is actually very, very nice. So I love enabling snapping because I think I might really want to use it altogether in most of the stuff that I'll be working on. Yeah, that's basically it to do with the snapping. Then there are rulers and guides in here. You can create 3D guides, those ones which are based on pixels. There are lots of settings in here. The origin of the guide, you can actually change it to different sort of origin. I prefer keeping it to the center. There is a Swiss sort of guidelines. You can create Swiss guidelines and then regional guidelines. You can actually copy a guideline and paste it, right? A grid, I mean, we're actually talking about grids. Then you can rotate them around, which is actually very nice. I'll keep it back to 0. And then you can enable margins, right? You know, on top, on the bottom, you know, which can be really, really nice. Let me go back in there. So you can add margins. As you can see, it's going to add some sort of margins on the left, on the right. Where you actually want to add margins, you can actually add margins in there and it will show within the preview. You can change it from size mode to divisions, you know, and there are different settings in there. You can change the major colors and minor colors, which is actually something really very, very nice. I'm just going to disable them for now. And then we have something called layout, right? I won't talk about it because it's a pro feature, but once you click on it, it actually updates the UI in line with the layouts that you would have created apparently. I'm not going to talk about it apparently. Now this is playback caching. If you've known anything to do with caching, once you enable it, it actually makes sure that it plays back, you know, kinda in an accelerated mode, which is actually very, very nice. So I recommend you to actually have it enabled so it will be seen whenever you're playing an animation. Yeah. So the composition boundaries, once you click onto it, you can disable or enable composition boundaries, which is actually very nice. Sometimes I wouldn't love to see the composition boundaries. You can actually change the color and enable it by just, you know, also pressing the button in there. Then we have the motion path, which you can toggle on and off, right? Just in case an animation is actually happening. Let me animate this again. Position. I'm just going to press on a keyframe and then create an animation going into the x-axis, and then just copy and paste this and just drag it a bit further, right? So once I'm dragging it further, you're going to see that sort of a path, but I can disable, enable it. I don't know which reason, by which reason I would actually disable it or something like that, but I prefer it being on. But you can enable and disable it, and you have, you know, this sort of settings which you can disable and enable. So I prefer it to be enabled. There's this sort of a thing which I will talk about. It's called an onion skin. An onion skin is basically showing the previous frame. I will go into some details of it, but for people who do create 2D sort of, you know, frame by frame sort of animations, you can enable what we call an onion skin, and when you draw something, an onion skin is actually going to really appear. You know, once you're creating frame by frame animation. Apparently I'm not creating frame by frame sort of animations, but once you're creating them, you'll see that sort of onion skin. I'm not going to go into that. I'll create maybe another video where we are creating a frame by frame animation and you see how it basically behaves. But in most of these animations that you're going to be creating, unless you're creating a frame by frame animation, you're really not going to need an onion skin, right? So we have this next sort of a button. It shows the clipping mask for selecting shapes. In Cavalry, you can create a clipping mask using different sort of shapes, apparently. So I can click on this sort of rectangle and just create a clipping mask by just linking it by just creating a connection, right? So once I click and it shows that sort of a blue, it shows that this is connectable, and I can create a clipping mask and create it to a new index, and then the rectangle happens to be clipping or acting as a clipping mask to the circle, and I can move the circle around, right? And you know, it will be masked within the rectangle, right? So this basically enables you to see, to show the clipping mask or not show it, which is actually nice. As you can see, once you enable it, it shows that boundary sort of a thing of the clipping mask, or it disables them, as you can see it in there, which sometimes is nice and sometimes, I don't know, not. So here, it's basically showing the transparency sort of a thing. You can actually show that they are transparency or not by enabling it in there. So that's basically the feature in there. And then we have this sort of information in here. You can decrease or increase the viewport quality from high, low, or lowest. There are also some other layer tools in here. You can enable them, right, or disable them, right? So I recommend you have them enabled. Then there's drawback information, which is actually normally shown. Let me see if you've enabled. If you've enabled maybe something like a duplicator, there are places in the next coming tutorials where we're going to really need to show some debug information or something like that. Let me just decrease this proportionally by pressing Alt and then add the duplicator, right? Once I click on the duplicator, you're going to see that sort of debug sort of information showing the indexes and where different indexes are. So once I disable the drawback information, it's going to, you know, disable the indexes. There are some places where we're going to actually need that sort of debug sort of information. Yeah, so there are also these other things which you can enable or disable, right? They're also present in the composition sort of settings in here. I've just pressed Ctrl K as a shortcut. You can set the composition settings. I can set this to 1080 by 1080 and it will adapt automatically. I can change the frame range. For example, it's actually moving up to 249 frames. I can change it to 100 frames and it will adapt, you know, down here. It's now to 200 frames. Then the playback range, the maximum is actually 100 since it's what I've set as a frame range. Once I change it to 248, it will actually be 248. That's the playback sort of range. We can change the time in here. We can change the frame rate, the background sort of color. We can also change it from here, but there's an easier way of changing it. We should be talking about the colors down in the next sort of video. Yeah, this is all to do with colors. You can change the playback steps. You can enable the motion blur, which gives you all these sort of things to change the center, the align blur, the shutter angle, yeah. Those are some of the things. Some of them we shall be going through them in the next coming